Hello everyone, welcome to today's video where we are going through 5 of the latest questions from operational procedures. So without any further ado, let's just jump into the questions. I'll try to give you some more detailed explanations and tips for the exams as well as your actual real flying. So for question number 1, according to ICAO noise abatement procedures during landing. So first of all, remember that there are two primary and most important noise abatement procedures that you need to remember: noise abatement procedure 1 and procedure number 2. The way I remember these is that remember that the noise abatement procedures are for two key reasons. Of course, to reduce noise. However, one is to reduce noise close to the airport, which is number 1, or further away from the airport, which is number 2. 2 is a bigger number, so it gives noise abatement at a bigger distance. Also remember that both of these procedures aim to do the same thing. Essentially, they regulate when you as a pilot should reduce the thrust from your flex or takeoff thrust to your climb thrust, and then when you should accelerate, meaning they regulate your thrust reduction altitude and your acceleration altitude. Noise abatement procedure 1 reduces the thrust at 1,000 feet above aerodrome level and accelerates at 3,000 feet above the aerodrome level. Noise abatement procedure 2, the way I remember it, is it does two things at once, meaning for noise abatement 2, you reduce the thrust and start acceleration both at 1,000 feet. And this will be the easier to follow and the more standard one, and it will make sure that further away from the airport the noise is reduced. However, remember that all of these noise abatement procedures, they can be always disregarded in the name and in terms of safety. So in this case, for example, you should remember that while they work during takeoff, as we just described, they can also work during landing. This can be read at the AOI of each airport, which will regulate all of these procedures. When it comes to landing, most airports will restrict the use of reverse thrust to idle reverse, because legally no noise abatement procedure can restrict the use of reverse thrust as a whole. However, remember that these procedures never apply if the runway is contaminated or wet. In these cases, you can always use full reverse, or if the safety requires you to do so. For question number 2, following an emergency landing, the commander of a flight should. So this is a great question that I'm sure you'll actually come across many times once you begin your type rating after you finish your ATPL or CPL training. None of these questions actually answers as accurately as I would like it to do. And in order for you to understand, I actually have pulled out here on the side an emergency evacuation checklist for an Airbus A320 to tell you what the actual checklist does. So remember that the first thing that you'll do after getting an aircraft to stop after an emergency, you will begin the emergency evacuation checklist. And that is if the landing is an emergency landing. In that case, the first 3 things that the pilot monitoring needs to do, in this case it will be always the CM2, the crew member number 2, so the sitting on the right seat, is to make sure the aircraft has stopped, the parking brake is on, advise the ATC, and number 3, alert the cabin crew. Now, when you alert the cabin crew, you do not say begin the evacuation or stand by. Each airline will have the procedure. However, you say something to bring the crew in order for them to be ready for a possible evacuation. So you do not say no to evacuation, you don't say yes. Only after you complete the entire emergency evacuation checklist, at the end there will be 2 options. Either evacuation initiate, or cabin crew and passengers notify if the evacuation is not required. This means that first and foremost, as the pilot monitoring is performing the emergency evacuation checklist, that is the time for the commander or the captain to assess the situation and decide whether the evacuation will be needed. And this is a very important step that every captain will do. This means that first you determine if the evacuation is required, and only then you complete the evacuation checklist and you decide if it is required or not, and then you proceed as follows. So this is something that every checklist in an Airbus or a Boeing aircraft will follow you to do. And essentially remember never to jump into action, however be methodical. Now for question number 3. During a commercial flight at 2,000 feet above ground level with a multi-engine piston aircraft, both engines catch on fire. and the aircraft is not equipped with engine fire extinguishing system. What would be an appropriate course of action unless stated otherwise in the AFM? So remember that fire is by far the absolutely worst emergency that you can have in any aircraft. So smoke or fire will always generate a land EASA red message, meaning that you should always look for alternative places to land, and if necessary, sometimes land even somewhere that might not be an airport if needed. And there are some accidents from the past, like the Swiss Air Flight 101, that will tell you exactly the same story. However, in case of any failure, and this is something that flight instructors like to ask many times, it's very important that you never try to figure out or create your own procedures. This is why we have the checklists, which would absolutely always be consulted first in case of any serious or less serious emergencies. So of course, carry out the engine fire checklist to shut down the engines, prepare for an immediate forced landing, which is always the case with the fire, and then extend the flaps only when it's assured the emergency landing area can be reached, and that is because the flaps will always generate drag and decrease your possible gliding distance once the engines are shut off. Any other answer here essentially asks you to create a procedure that doesn't exist, and it is very vital that you always, first and foremost, go to the checklist, and remember the checklists are not memory items, meaning you are always supposed to consult them, even if you believe that you will waste a little bit of time. Trust me, doing the checklist is never a waste of time. And now for question number 4. For a commander to commence a takeoff, the visibility at the aerodrome of departure must be equal to or better than the applicable departure minima. So this is an interesting question as well. However, this is something that you will definitely study during your low visibility operations classes once you begin your type rating as well. Remember that when you take off, very often the minimum takeoff distance, which of course is 550, will be low visibility operations, and it can go as low as to 400 meters of RVR. If you take off with 400 meters of RVR at an airport that does not have Cat 2 or Cat 3 landing capability, you need to remember that once you have a failure after takeoff, it might be impossible to come back and land because you do not have the appropriate minima to return. In that case, you always need to select a suitable takeoff alternate that in case something goes wrong, so a passenger has a medical problem, the aircraft has a technical problem, in that case, you can always safely land according to both the adequacy of the airport, the runways there, as well as the meteorological conditions, so the weather. So remember that in that case, it has to be, the minima has to be equal or better than the applicable minima for landing, unless a suitable takeoff alternate aerodrome is available. So if the minimum RVR required by the procedure at this aerodrome is 1000 meters and the RVR at the airport is 600 meters, yes, you can take off legally if there is a specific departure is available. However, because the RVR is lower than the minima, you need to find a takeoff alternate that will allow you to land if something goes wrong. And now for the last question, so question number 5. What could be the consequence if an aircraft with in-flight crew rest facilities is to be used for an upcoming flight, but is replaced by another aircraft which lacks the facilities? So this question, like some of the others, is not completely full, and the answers here are not 100% satisfactory for me. However, it is always best in such cases not to overthink the answers. And of course, in this case, answer Charlie, so the planned flight is compromised due to the lack of rest facilities, will be the correct one. However, just to go through some of the other answers, remember that once you start beginning your flight, you have your maximum flight duty period. Every airline will outline their specific maximum flight duty periods because sometimes your airline might want you to have a bit more rest than the legal minimum. This will definitely depend on the time when you begin or finish your duty, because if you are beginning very early or ending very late, this rests of in-flight and outside of the flight, as well as your maximum duty periods, can be different. However, remember that the 12 hours is the top, as well as there are possible extensions of these flight duty limitations and times. And there are some of the answers that, for example, say crew can request an additional rest period after landing. Remember that crew always has to fly the legal maximum plus the extension and no more. If the extension comes into effect, so let's say you fly 13 hours because 1 hour extension was needed, then your minimum flight rest, your rest period has to be increased and has to be no lower than your actual flight duty period. So in that case, this also makes a little bit of sense. There are also different types of crew rest in flight possibilities, which actually do include the crews to rest in the passenger seats if the conditions permit. However, in these cases, this rest is not considered as good as in a secluded area, like the one that we talk here in the question. All of this can be cross-checked in the EASA Easy Access rules for the part FCL, and this will all be stated here as well as the part Oro, so I highly recommend that you check it out if you'd like to know a bit more about the flight crew rests and maximum flight duty periods. This is everything, however, that we have here for operational procedures, so I hope this was interesting. I wish you all the best in your upcoming exams. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments below, and I highly encourage you to get the Airhead account if you'd like to see more questions like this. So until next time, I wish to see you in the next video. Have a fantastic day, and bye-bye.